think about what you've accomplished in the last 10 years. Now, let's dive right into this explainer and look at how one guy, just one young man, literally rewired the entire map of the ancient world in that same amount of time. We are looking at a historical figure whose name has become pretty much completely synonymous with conquest. A young king driven by ambition, glory, and this almost impossible dream to conquer the world.
32. Okay, what's really wild about this number is that by the time Alexander died at this exact age, he had conquered the massive Persian Empire, marched across thousands of miles of completely unfamiliar territory, and controlled a huge chunk of the known world. Before he even blew out the candles on his 33rd birthday, he had defeated armies vastly larger than his own and reached the very edge of the world as his people knew it. But how on earth do you achieve all of that so incredibly fast?
Part 1. Inheriting an impossible dream. Because to understand how he moved with such velocity, we really have to look at the foundation built by his father, King Philip II of Macedon. You see, Alexander didn't just wake up one day and decide to conquer the globe out of nowhere.
The crucial point here is that when 20-year-old Alexander became king in 336 BC, right after his father's sudden assassination, he didn't start from scratch. Not at all. Philip was a master political strategist and a military genius in his own right. He had basically created the famous Macedonian phalanx, this infantry formation wielding these incredibly long spears called sarissas. It created a literal wall of spear points that was almost impossible to break. He also built up a highly lethal cavalry and had already united much of Greece. So Alexander inherited this finely tuned, unstoppable military machine. And when local Greek city-states rebelled to test the new kid on the throne, Alexander used that machine to absolutely crush the opposition with extraordinary speed, locking down his rule immediately.
Part 2. The Blitzkrieg of Antiquity. Because once his own kingdom was secure, Alexander didn't take a breather to celebrate. He immediately pivoted to his father's ultimate, unfinished master plan, invading the massive Persian Empire. When he crossed the Hellespont, that narrow strait separating Europe from Asia, in 334 BC, the odds looked absolutely impossible on paper. I mean, Alexander is walking in with an army of maybe 40,000 soldiers. The Persian Empire, on the flip side, stretched from the eastern Mediterranean all the way out toward Central Asia. They had generations of entrenched power, vastly greater resources, and incredibly massive armies. But Alexander utilized relentless speed, extreme discipline, and just an uncanny tactical brilliance to bridge that massive gap. What happens next is this insane domino effect of conquest. First up, the Battle of the Granicus. Alexander doesn't just sit in a tent giving orders. He personally leads his cavalry into the thick of the fight and wins. Then jump to 333 BC at the Battle of Issus. He's facing the undefeated Persian King Darius III and a much larger force, but Alexander attacks with such astonishing aggression right at the Persian center that Darius actually panics and flees the battlefield. His entire army collapses. But honestly, my favorite detail is step 3, the Siege of Tyre. Tyre was this heavily fortified island city off the coast, and Alexander didn't have an easy way to attack it. So what does he do? He literally builds a road through the ocean. His engineers spend months constructing a massive physical causeway from the mainland straight to the island, rolling up siege towers and attacking with ships until the city finally fell. It is just sheer, relentless willpower. After Tyre, he just keeps pushing south. And here's the ultimate irony of his brutal campaign. When he gets to Egypt, they don't even fight him. They actually welcome him as a liberator from Persian rule and recognize him as a real-deal pharaoh. While he's hanging out there, he founds the city of Alexandria. Now, we know this city would eventually become one of the greatest intellectual and cultural hubs of the entire ancient world, but Alexander? He didn't linger to soak in the fame. He was already looking back toward Mesopotamia. His real target was the very heart of Persia. And this brings us to the decisive blow, which brilliantly illustrates his battlefield genius, the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC. Darius had assembled an absolutely enormous force, clearly hoping to rely on overwhelming numbers to just crush the Macedonians. But Alexander, relying on extreme tactical skill, manages to identify this single, fleeting weakness in the massive Persian formation. It's like finding a single loose thread and unraveling a whole sweater. He creates an opening, and just like at Issus, he drives his forces directly toward King Darius. And once again, the Persian king runs. By spotting that one weakness, Alexander effectively ended the greatest empire of the ancient Near East. Babylon surrendered, Susa fell, Persepolis was captured, the entire Persian Empire was his. Part 3. Reaching the breaking point. Alexander actually pursued Darius deep into the eastern provinces until the Persian king was ultimately betrayed and killed by his own men.
But the conqueror's next moves created some deep, deep friction with his absolutely exhausted troops.
You see, Alexander's vision was evolving. He stopped seeing himself as merely a Macedonian king and started viewing himself as the ruler of a vast multicultural empire. He started wearing Persian-style clothing. He actually went so far as to incorporate Persian soldiers into his own elite army. He married Roxana, a Central Asian noblewoman, and actively encouraged his Macedonian soldiers to marry Persians too. But his men, the guys who had been marching in the dirt and fighting for years, they didn't always share this grand vision. They were exhausted. But Alexander just kept pushing them further east, into Central Asia, and eventually right to the doorstep of India. In 327 BC, this relentless push brought him into the Indian subcontinent, culminating in the brutal Battle of the Hydaspes against King Porus. Porus utilized these massive war elephants, which the Macedonians had rarely faced on such a terrifying scale. Alexander won the battle, of course, but he was incredibly impressed by his enemy's dignity under pressure. The source material notes that when Alexander asked the defeated Porus how he wished to be treated, Porus simply looked at him and replied, "Like a king." Alexander admired that level of respect so much that he actually allowed Porus to remain in power under his authority.
But guys, this was the breaking point. Alexander wanted to push even further, heading toward the Ganges. His men, however, finally said no. At the Hyphasis River, these hardened soldiers who had literally marched for years mutinied. They flatly refused to take another step east. Alexander was furious, but he was finally forced to turn back. And the journey west was an absolute tragedy. They marched through these harsh, unforgiving deserts where thousands of his men suffered and slowly died from heat, thirst, and hunger before the survivors finally staggered back into Babylon. Part 4. A complicated, immortal legacy. Back in Babylon, you'd think Alexander would take a break, right? Nope. He was already planning new expeditions toward Arabia. But in 323 BC, he suddenly became severely ill, and after days of worsening health, he died before his 33rd birthday, leaving no adult heir to take the reins. Almost instantly, the empire fragments. His great kingdom simply did not survive as a unified state. His top generals immediately began fighting for power, tearing the map apart to establish their own kingdoms. The Seleucid Empire emerged across Asia, while Ptolemy grabbed Egypt and set up his famous dynasty there. His political empire was gone in a flash, but something far more enduring actually survived in its wake. And that is the Hellenistic Age. Alexander's campaigns created this vast network, connecting regions that had previously been separated by enormous geographic and political boundaries. Greek language, culture, and ideas just started freely mixing with Egyptian, Persian, and Indian traditions. These new cities he founded, especially places like Alexandria, became thriving centers of trade and learning. You had scientists, mathematicians, astronomers, and philosophers from totally different backgrounds working together, which fundamentally changed human history and accelerated the development of the ancient world. Honestly, this mixing of cultures essentially laid the foundational blueprints for the interconnected, globalized world we live in today. When you stack the timeline up side by side like this, the sheer unrelenting speed is staggering. He inherits a kingdom at 20, enters Asia at 22, defeats the Persian king at 24, conquers Persia by 29, fights in India at 30, and by 32 controls the known world. He transformed the political and cultural map of human civilization in little more than a decade. It's a pace of conquest that is almost hard to even wrap your head around. But as we objectively evaluate the source material in this explainer, we really see two parallel realities of his legacy. On one side, he was this celebrated military genius, admired by later heavyweights like Julius Caesar, a visionary who connected distant cultures and inspired breathtaking loyalty from his men. But on the flip side, we absolutely cannot ignore the immense human cost. He besieged cities, violently suppressed anyone who dared to rebel, displaced entire populations, and destroyed ancient kingdoms. His relentless ambition brought war and destruction across vast swaths of the earth. We don't take sides here, but it's vital to see that both of these realities exist simultaneously in his story. Which brings us to a final thought to leave you with today. A king who refused to stop, a commander who crossed entire continents, and a young man whose ambition just grew larger than the world itself. His political empire collapsed the second he died, but his story, that survived. It makes you wonder, was his greatest, most lasting conquest not the physical land he took, but simply the immortal idea of Alexander the Great? It's a story that echoes far beyond his short 32 years of life, and one that we are still trying to fully unpack today.